simply all that means is that I wish God's peace upon you. Christians, Muslims, Jews, anybody who believes in God can say that. So I'm going to start this off with that blessing to all of you. So today's lecture is Women in Islam, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So I'm going to give a little bit of history. I'm going to talk about how women historically have been empowered in Islam, and then I'm going to move up to modern day Islam. But I did want to start with something that was recently in the news. So last month, Shariff along with other women, as you can see, were the first all-women flight crew for the Royal Brunei Airlines. And it's really ironic because they actually flew into Saudi Arabia, where women aren't even allowed to drive. So to me, that's the perfect juxtaposition, it's very ironic, of how different Muslim cultures can actually have a different interpretation of what it means to be a Muslim woman. So you can see very empowered Muslim women, and you can see countries or individuals that are not as empowered for whatever reasons. So I just wanted to start off with, kind of breaking that stereotype. So Sharifa herself, she actually became the airline captain back in 2012. So she did this like years ago. So when, I'm sorry. Oh, what? I'm not. Okay. How do I move it? Oh, perfect. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to start out with a quote from the Quran. Women in the Quran actually are considered spiritually equal to men. And actually, so in the story of Genesis, we know that Christians believe that Eve is to blame for man's fall from grace. In Islam, that's not true. In Islam, actually, the blame is given both evenly to Adam and to Eve. And there's this quote from Surah 33, line 23. Verily, men who surrender unto God, and women who surrender, and men who believe, and women who believe, and men who obey, and women who obey, and men who speak the truth, and women who speak the truth, and the men who give alms, and women who give alms, and men who fast, and women who fast, and men who guard their modesty, and women who guard their modesty, and men who remember God, and women who remember God. God hath prepared for them forgiveness and a vast reward. So right here from this quote from the Quran, it shows that men and women have to do equally the same things to go to heaven and to be considered pious people. So right here, we're just starting off with this premise that in Islam, men and women are spiritually equal. So, hold on. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the hijab question, because I know that that's a really popular, kind of controversial thing, and a lot of times in the West especially, people try to say that that's like a form of repression, so how can women be equal if women are wearing the hijab? Well, first of all, in the Quran, it actually doesn't tell you distinctly what you're supposed to wear. It basically says men and women are supposed to be modest. And it says that women should take their khamir, and with their khamir they should cover their chest. Now, one interpretation is that the khamir was something that was worn over your head, so obviously it's saying to also cover yourself with this. But throughout the Muslim world, there are many different interpretations of this, and as we know in Islam, there is no compulsion in religion. So a lot of times when people in the West are saying that a woman is repressed for wearing the hijab, now we have all kinds of situations, and there might be a time when that's true, but a lot of the times it's because a woman is doing this from her heart, and this is her way of expressing her spirituality and her commitment to God. That's not to say that a Muslim woman can wear Western dress and not be a good Muslim. Of course, the same goes for Muslim women, however they dress. It's up to choice. And in different cultures, as you'll see, different Muslim women dress differently. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. So women's right in Islamic tradition. Islam is a religion that's rooted in human rights. So I have a hadith here, and it says, women are not oppressed in Islam. Any Muslim man that oppresses a woman is not following Islam. Among the many teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, they protected the rights and the dignity of women, and he has been known to say, the best among you are those who treat their wives well. And then also, we also know from the Quran that there's no compulsion in religion. Truth has been made clear from error. So between the hadith and also this quote here, we see that within Islam, nobody is supposed to be forced to do anything. It's supposed to come from your heart. And also, we also understand that the Prophet Muhammad, he was a civil rights activist, in my view. We have hadith after hadith. And as far as women, he was always talking about treating your wives well, treating your mothers well. Let's see. So that leads me to talking about Khadija. She was the first wife of the Prophet Muhammad, and she's known as the mother of the believers. And I use this quote that's also from the Quran: your wives are a garment for you, and you are a garment for them. Because once again, just like the quote earlier that I showed you from the Quran, this shows equality. Women are this, men are this. It doesn't mean that in the Quran it doesn't say that there are certain roles and aspects that men are supposed to have and women are supposed to have, but ultimately it's saying that you're both equal and you both have duties and you both have responsibilities. So once again, I mean, it's open to interpretation, but I think you can see that there is an effort made within the Quranic verses that's saying men and women are spiritually equal and have equal duties. So Khadija was a really interesting woman. Actually, not only was she 15 years older than the Prophet Muhammad when they were married, but also she was a very powerful businesswoman. And actually, he was very scared during the first revelations of the Prophet Muhammad, and she was there for him emotionally, she was there for him spiritually, and actually at the time of different wars, when the Quraysh and different tribes in the Middle East were attacking the first Muslims, she was there, and she had a lot of money, and she fed people, and she housed people, and she created mosques. And I would have to say that she was his right-hand woman, and without her, there wouldn't have been Islam. So women's rights are rooted in the Quran and the life of the Prophet Muhammad himself. And I have this quote from Karen Armstrong. She's a religious scholar. Actually, she's Christian. She was a nun for several years. And it's from Islam, A Short History. The emancipation of women was a project dear to the Prophet's heart. The Quran gave women rights of inheritance and divorce centuries before Western women were accorded such status. The Quran prescribes some degree of segregation of veiling for the Prophet's wives, but there's nothing in the Quran that requires the veiling of all women or their seclusion in a separate part of the house. These customs were adopted some 3 or 4 generations after the Prophet's death. And something that I'd also like to add is that during the time of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, he did stop a lot of really unjust, misogynistic practices. One was infanticide of young girls, so that if somebody had a baby and it was a female baby, people would kill that baby. He stopped that. He stood up for women's rights. And I think that a lot of times when you go to any area, you're going to find that local customs and local traditions are going to infuse the religion. And so I think sometimes people might see old customs and they might think that that's the religion, but it's not. Because as we can see, the Prophet Muhammad and the Quran itself, which came from God, actually has rights for women, rights of inheritance, rights of divorce, rights in marriage. And these things were not seen in the Western world for another 1,000 years. So I want to go to a really powerful woman, and her name was Rabia Basri. And so have you guys ever heard of the Sufi sect of Islam? She's actually the most, I guess, influential Sufi. She talks about divine love of God. That's loving God just for the sake of God. Not for a reward, not out of fear. And so she said, "Oh God, if I worship you for fear of hell, burn me in hell. And if I worship you in hope of paradise, exclude me from paradise. But if I worship you for your own sake, grudge me not your everlasting beauty." So actually there was a 13th century scholar by the name of Attar, and he was asked, why would you put this woman in your book of Sufi mystics, of important Muslim scholars? This was in the 13th century. And I thought his quote was interesting, and I think it's pretty definitive of Islam itself. And he says, "God does not regard your outward forms. The root of the matter is not form, but your inner intention." And there's ayah, that's quote after quote in the Quran, that talks about it's your intention. It doesn't matter if you wish something good and it comes out badly. What matters is what's inside of your heart. And you're not going to be judged if you're a man or a woman, rich or poor, what your ethnicity or race is. You're going to be judged by your heart. You're going to be judged by who you are as a human being. And so that's basically what this scholar was saying when he was asked, why did you put a woman in your book? He said, because she was, very spiritually enlightened, and that's what was important here in the matter. So, a little bit later in history, we have the Spanish Caliphate in Spain, and it was a medieval renaissance for women and for gender equality. And here we have Lubna of Cordova. This is supposed to actually be a portrait of her. And some say she was a slave, some just say she was in lowly ranks. But over a amount of time, she actually revealed herself and also was educated. And she wound up being the main person, the head of this one huge library with over 5,000 books. And actually, she became like the king's son's tutor. She wrote many books of mathematics and of poetry. So she went from very lowly ranks to becoming this woman that even today, actually, I was Googling it. And in London today, they have a Lubna of Cordova school for Muslim girls. So even early on at this point in history, you have women in Islam that are rulers, that are scholars, that are doing things, that are leaders. And Lubna is a really interesting exception too. This is kind of, I don't know what happened. So a lot of you may have heard of this one philosopher. His name in the West is Averroes, and we call him Ibn Rushd. And he was very influential in the West. He was a mathematician, he talked about law, he talked about theology. He also interpreted Plato. And one thing Plato talks about in the Republic is he talks about the different roles that individuals should have in society. And actually, Plato was a bit misogynistic. He didn't feel women should do more, could do more than just have babies. And then if you were a good woman, then you would have good babies, and that's about it. Averroes, he actually made it a point to argue that. And basically, where my quote is cut off here, it basically says, and it's based on the Islamic precept that I was showing earlier from the Quran, that men and women are spiritually equal. We might be different, but we are spiritually equal. And that's basically that if women are equal to men, then that doesn't exclude women who could be warriors, governors, and philosophers. So this is impressive, and I think that sets a precedent for Islam too. We have the Prophet Muhammad, we have his Sahaba, his early followers, but then even, a little bit later, we have philosophers that influenced the West that were actually also feminists. And I will say that, Islam is rooted in civil rights, and I will say that we have example after example of not just women, but men that were feminists. I think Muslim men get a really bad rap, especially in the media, women to being submissive and men for being like horrible tyrants. But really within the religion itself, that's not accepted. And we have so many wonderful examples of intellectuals and leaders and the Prophet himself that didn't feel that way either. So another thing, I guess, going back to the last slide about women in Andalusia, was women were actually part of all of the intellectual and cultural events. They were scientists, they were poets, and it's really amazing because this was in the 1400s, the 1500s, and even as early with Lubna, I think as early as maybe 900, that you have women that are having these kind of roles as leading libraries and scholars and teachers, scientists and poets. And you didn't see that very often in the West, but in Andalusia, this was a common thing. And it, once again, is rooted in Islam. Now, I can't say that there aren't practitioners of Islam today or countries today that are doing that same thing. Some are, some aren't, as we're going to see in a moment here. But we can see from the inception of Islam, and even hundreds of years later, that this practice of equality and of gender equality has been in Islam just throughout its history. Okay, so leading up to some exceptional female leaders. So we were talking about Averroes saying that there were women who can be warriors, can be intellectuals, can be philosophers. The first woman that I have here is Noor Inayat Khan. And I learned about her myself a few years ago. She was very interesting. So she was half Indian Muslim, half Russian. And she actually fought during World War II for the English army. And she was a spy and she was a nurse. And she fought very bravely, and eventually she was caught by the Germans, by the Nazis. And they say that, and that's what this little thing says here, that her last words before they shot her, before they executed her, was "Liberté." So they, in different spots in England, they actually have statues to Noor Inayat Khan. So she's a really fascinating woman that you don't normally hear about. But this was a Muslim woman who fought in World War II. She fought very bravely, and she died. She was actually a kind of martyr. And then the woman in the middle here, one second. This is Zainab. Ghazali, and she was an Egyptian activist, Islamic scholar, writer, and lecturer. She was even persecuted in her own country at some point. And so that's just to show, I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg, honestly, guys, that there are women warriors in Islam, there are women activists and writers and scholars. And then the last one here, I really love this quote. This woman, her name's Yasmin, and her sister Dalia is actually one of the advisors on Muslims to President Obama. And she's a great writer and Islamic scholar herself. And she says, truly spiritual people are more forgiving of others. They're able to forgive the weakness in others because spirituality teaches you to see your own. So a lot of people would think that sounds very Christian. A lot of people in the West don't equate, I think, like forgiveness and compassion with Islam. But actually in Islam, it's throughout Islam. It's throughout our prayers. It's throughout everything. And if you go to even the female scholars, you can see that there's extensive work talking about how we should behave as Muslims. So once again, the Western precept that women don't do anything, Muslim women are always behind the scenes, they don't do anything, is untrue. And it's not just a modern thing. It goes back to from the very beginning of Islam. So there have been many women presidents and political leaders in the Muslim modern world. The first one is the first female to hold such a powerful and prominent office in Pakistan. And this is Benazir Bhutto, and she actually was president for 2 different terms, once in the late 80s from 88 to 90, once again from 1993 to 1996. And she actually wrote a really good book. I think it was called Reconciliation. It came out shortly before her death in 2005, 2006. But she's a profound Islamic leader. So once again, if somebody is going to say that women are downtrodden in Islam, that women have less rights, well, has America had its first female president yet? Because Pakistan did in 1988. And this woman is actually the current leader of Bangladesh. Her name is Sheikh Hasina, and she was the Prime Minister of Bangladesh in 2009, and she still holds that position. And then we have this woman, just to show also that while some women wear hijab by choice, sometimes not by choice, but usually if you see a woman in power, she's wearing it by choice to show the world her spiritual duty. But this woman, she's from Kosovo. We have a lot of Muslims all over Europe. Muslims, actually, the most Muslims are in Southeast Asia and South Asia, making about 62% of the Muslim world. And then you have, of course, obviously in the Middle East, quite a bit of Muslims. But also in Eastern Europe, you have a stronghold of Muslims, not just in Turkey and the former Ottoman Empire, but in Yugoslavia. So in Kosovo, we have this woman, I'm not very familiar with her name, but Atifet Jahja. And she's the first female president in any Balkan country, and she's also the youngest one. Yeah, she does look pretty young. And then we have this woman, and actually she was just elected in Mauritius last year. Her name is Amina Garab Fakim, and actually the really interesting thing about her, and I heard about her on NPR, is Mauritius is not a Muslim country. They have Muslims, but Muslims are actually a minority in this country. And this woman still got elected nonetheless, even though she's a Muslim. So once again, I think that shifts our paradigms when we think that we're very progressive in the West or we're very progressive in the United States. But, I mean, what have we dealt with the past 8 years with people saying Obama is a secret Muslim because his father that he wasn't even raised with was a Muslim? First of all, where does it say in the Constitution that a Muslim can't be president of the United States? It doesn't. Now here we have another country, a little island, Mauritius, that doesn't even have a lot of Muslims, and they're electing a Muslim female president. So once again, you can see something a little bit paradigm shifting. Also, I found this really interesting. In Senegal, they've actually had 2 female prime ministers. They've been short-lived. The first one is Mame Madior Boye from 2001 to 2002. And then in 2013 to 2014, there was a woman named Anamate Toure. So Senegal has had 2 different female prime ministers. And then, of course, we have the most famous of Muslim leaders today. We have Malala, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2014. But a lot of people don't know about Malala is that her father pushed her to be the person that she is today. Her father actually has worked for the BBC for about 20 years now, and he's always encouraged her to be outspoken. And even before she was attacked by the Taliban, she actually was a junior correspondent for the BBC in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So actually she's a really amazing girl, but she's amazing because her family pushed her to be who she was. So a lot of people might say that Malala is a rarity or aberration, but she's not. She's actually, her parents are living out those Islamic ideals that we went over, that are historical, that are in Hadith, and that are also in the Quran itself. So why should all of this matter to you? So I have a couple of points why I think this should matter to Muslims and non-Muslims alike. Muslim women are just one group of many in the world that have been stereotyped and deeply misunderstood. They are among the most misunderstood and underrepresented in the media. So shouldn't we bring truth to light about all people, even if you're not a Muslim? Shouldn't we, if we want truth to light to be told about our group, wouldn't we want that to be told about other groups too? And then that way of thinking can become more prominent in the world. So that's one reason to care. Another one is when we open our hearts and minds to one person, to one group, to one idea, we open the door potentially to infinitely other people, ideas, and possibilities. You're expanding your life. You're expanding even possibilities for yourself. And then you just might be inspired to be your own higher self or have your deepest ideals reaffirmed by people or ideas that have been unfamiliar to you prior. So maybe one of these women that I've talked about today, these historical women or even current leaders, might be somebody that you say, I want to look more into because you know what, I want to be like that myself someday, or you know what, I really like that idea. And the person doesn't have to have the same religion as you. They don't have to be exactly like you in any way for you to be inspired by them. But if the media or if our school system are holding these people back, if you're not learning about them and you have this idea, this precept in your mind that all Muslim women are wives and daughters that don't do anything, then obviously, you're not going to look into it. But if somebody tells you, you might be inspired. And then to truly understand Islam is what it's truly based in, theologically, philosophically, and historically, it's integral to understand women in Islam. Which leads me to the last thing, and this is in Islam, that when a Muslim girl is born, she becomes a reason for her father to enter paradise. And that's because there's a hadith with the Prophet Muhammad, and it says whoever educates girls, especially 2 or more, will go to heaven. And then when she grows up and marries a man, she completes half of his religion, and that's because in the Quran it says that to complete half of your religion, you should get married. And then it says that paradise is under your mother's feet, so paradise will be under her feet. That is the status of women in Islam. So now I'm going to open it up to question and answers. You can tell I was a little nervous, probably went really fast. So if you want me to, illustrate, go through it a little bit more. I guess my main goal today was to break the stereotypes that we see in the media about Muslim women. Whether you think Muslim women have only been empowered recently, or that they've never been empowered, or if you think that within Islam itself, it's saying what these jihadis and extremists are saying to do, when actually those people are not based in Quran, they're not based in Hadith, they're not based in history. And I hope that I kind of illustrated that point. Yes?
It's not so much a question, I'll answer it. I grew up in a Muslim family, and I come from a family of educated Muslim women from a Middle Eastern country, actually. And my mother was an engineer, and her mother was an educator in university, and my wife actually happens to be more educated than myself. She's got more education under her belt than I do. So it's very true what you say, and I think those that have traveled around the Muslim world will know that those who visited places like Turkey and stuff will really, I don't mean to attack the American political system, but we still sit around and categorize people and candidates, whether they're male, female, black, or white.
Not by who they really are. Like,
yeah, we haven't moved, like in this country that we claim to be, we are a democracy of the world. We still haven't moved past categorizing people by race, color, height, and female and male.
Yeah.
When so many other countries around the world are past that, and we're looking at candidates based on who they are, regardless of what color they are, if they're a guy or a girl.
Yeah.
So, and I think it's just the time aspect. Thanks for a great talk.
Absolutely. And bringing that up, I mean, half of my family is Pakistani and Muslim. My dad's sister was the superintendent of all the schools in Karachi, Pakistan in the 80s and 90s until she retired. Karachi is actually the 11th biggest city in the world. It's a huge city. And as far as I have a lot of cousins, and all my cousins, they're doctors and they're engineers and computer programmers. So yeah, in my family, there are very few women that are uneducated or just housewives. And if they are, it's because they choose to be, not because they don't have any other choice.
I have a question. What do you think that so much of this knowledge about the role of women in history like being ignored? What do you think is there a tendency to like? Why don't we know about it? Why do we only hear the?
I do have an answer for that. I feel like, and I think if you're from any group that's not Anglo and Christian and upper class, you'll feel this too. There's a narrative in history that's usually sold to us, and it's to keep the people in power in power. And I think that since the West doesn't have such a hot history of how it's treated women, not only is it inconvenient because you don't want Muslims, you don't want the other, the one that's reflected to be everything bad, to have something on you that's better than you. And actually, historically, from the inception of Islam, women's rights have, and also human rights just in general, to not judge people by their race, to not judge people by how much money they have, but to judge them by the content of their character, has always been in Islam. It's central to Islam. So I think it's really convenient for people who want to make Muslims and Arabs look bad to say that, oh, look, all their women are this way, all their women are scared and they're covered up, instead of saying, you know what, some of these women are covered up by choice because they want to be seen for the content of their character and not judged by what they look like.
Can I add to that too?
Yes.
I agree with him. These stereotypes are based to a certain extent on something true. I think there is a lot of that in the Muslim world, to what he's saying.
There is some of that.
But I would add to
there's plenty
that.
of examples that's not true, and that goes throughout history.
I would add to that. I think the more reason to that is cultural traditions more than Islam. And the biggest, if there's any Indians in the room, they'll know in India it has nothing to do with being Muslim or not Muslim. And if you visit some of the Sikh areas, like in Punjab, you'll look at women's status there, or in southern India, in some of the Hindu provinces, and look at women's status there, and they have nothing to do with Islam. And I think Islam actually came to crush some of these traditions. When Islam came to the Arab Peninsula, it was full of races, like really as racist as you can ever get was the people that lived there. And Yasmin mentioned the killing of the children. So they had these things in them that Islam came to take away. But I think these things existed within culturally. And some of the covering up was actually cultural more than it was religious, and it carried on. And I'll go back to Egypt because I'm Egyptian. In southern Egypt, there's many provinces that are majority Christians, and they'll still cover up head to toe in black. They're Christians, and they're covered head to toe in black.
Well, it's pre-Islamic, actually.
And it's a pre-Islamic tradition to those people that live there, and it has nothing to do with their religion. So I think a lot of that exists under tradition. And if anything, Islam came to say this is wrong, and those that actually read will know that this is wrong, and those that don't, it's mainly tradition rather than Islam.
Absolutely, and that's why early on I was going to the different quotes in the Quran as well as Hadith that, state women have these rights in marriage, women have these rights to divorce. Or this quote from the Coalition, Surah 33, that basically says, men must do these things, women must do these things, men must do these things, women must do these things. It's just saying it again and again that we're equal spiritually. And, sorry, his name?
I think the right for a woman to ask for divorce is huge. I mean, that's not
it's
something
huge. It's
that doesn't
1,000 years
exist.
before it was given to women in the West. And also the right for women to have their inheritance, because I was looking it up and I didn't include it in here, maybe for another time, but it's amazing how many women in early Islam and in the Middle East got inheritances. And they created colleges, they created hospitals, they created different charity organizations with their inheritances. And at one point in what's today's Syria, I believe, in Aleppo, and this was hundreds of years ago, I think it was like 51% of the charities and hospitals were actually run by women. And I think that's all due to women's right to inheritance and women's right to, having certain rights within marriage so that she's not a nothing, she is a somebody.
And another additional commentary that you made is that I discussed with some of my students about this before, and one thing that comes up usually is the question that I understand because it comes from a point of view of not having enough knowledge about the moment culture is one thing, and then the inspiration of religion is another thing. So there's a tendency not to distinguish between one and the other. So one question that comes very often, and I was talking to somebody today early on when I mentioned them about the election day, and he told me that he had gone to San Antonio and he had been in a mosque over there, so that the women have to be a certain way, dressed in a certain way. So I was trying to tell them that as far as those dressing codes are more culturally imposed, right, than they are in the Quran.
Right.
So I don't know if you want to clarify a little bit about that.
Yeah, in the Quran it says to be modest, okay, and that says for men and for women to be modest. And then also there is a section in the Quran that says take your kamir and cover yourself with your kamir. And one argument for hijab is that traditionally in the Middle East, kamir meant something that you, like a scarf that you covered your head with. So you can make that argument for it, but like I said, there's a million different interpretations to how a woman in Islam should dress. And I think more and more in the Quran, you see that it's more about your inward intention and your inward, how you act and how you behave as a person.
I guess the people here in the West, actually, in the West, see that as if you're wearing that means that you are secluded and that's a single expression. How would you counter that narrative?
I counter that narrative all the time, and the way I counter that narrative is, yes, there probably are some women, and I probably may even have a few of them in my family because they're from Pakistan and India, that wear it because their husbands tell them to wear it. But I also have a lot of women, including pre-med students in my family, that wear the hijab religiously. And the reason they do it is because they want to express to the world that I'm a Muslim woman. I'm here for God, I'm not here for anything else. So that's actually powerful, that's empowering. That's not oppression. And I think it doesn't matter if a person's dressed in a bikini or a hijab, it can be done oppressively. It can be done because you have low self-esteem or because you're afraid or because you want to please somebody other than God. And I think you can dress and this, I'm not saying every Muslim thinks this way, I'm an American Muslim, but I think that you can dress the way you want to, and as long as you're keeping God in your mind, then you're not oppressed. Or you can be thinking about freedom in your mind, and you're not oppressed. You're not trying to live by somebody else's standards. You're doing it for something inside. And it's very true with women in the hijab, especially in the West. It's a very brave choice to make, especially in today's socio-political climate. Yes?
I wanted to add to what he was saying about women dressing in an Islamic way, as in wearing hijab and covering themselves as a show of oppression or something like that. But if you think about the way society is today, as of how things are run, women, Islamic women dress themselves and cover themselves head to toe, and for the most part, they don't have to worry about, their main goal is not how I look today, what makeup I'm wearing, or how my hair is done and stuff like that and what am I wearing and stuff like that. Where in the base of today's society, I would say 80% of people that's what they're worried about, and that's like what makeup I'm wearing now, or how would people perceive how I look, and how you could say that women are oppressed because they wear that, but who is really oppressed? The person who has to wear all these makeup to cover themselves up to look a certain way for the appeal of other people, or the woman who dressed in all black, cover themselves up and doesn't have to even worry about anything like that, and is still loved by everyone that sees her and sees her how she really is, not how she appealed to people.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting to find out, to compare those two, a woman who wear makeups and wear all these stuff, because the society tell them that's the way you should look, and that's the good thing about it. That's what it means to look good. Or the women who cover themselves and show up modesty and doesn't necessarily worry about how
And
to look.
actually, that reminds me of the hadith when somebody asked, ask the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, what qualities should a man look for in marrying a woman? And he said, well, okay, so, we're going to marry her for her beauty. She comes from a good family. She's wealthy. But most importantly, you're going to marry her because she's religious. And if you don't marry her for a spiritual reason, then you're a fool. That's basically the gist of the hadith. And so I think that kind of shows that in Islam, above other things, it's very practical. Yeah, those things are going to come into play. But most importantly is that the spiritual content of that woman. Because she's going to raise your children, she's going to be in your life. You want a person that has a strong moral character. say that, Islamic women can also be very fashionable, and it does say in the Quran that, you should beautify yourself for Allah because God does love beauty. So that doesn't mean that Islamic women are plain. We have a lot of art in Islam, and we have a lot of people who dress up beautifully. And in our different cultures, from Pakistan and India to different places in the Middle East to Egypt and Morocco, we see beautiful dresses and we see beautiful hijabs and all kinds of things. So it's not to say that Muslim women are very dry, boring people, because we're not. And another thing before we do wrap it up, a friend of mine, I won't say who said it, wanted me to bring up the issue of polygamy because it is one that gives Muslim men and Muslim women a bad rap. So in Islam, you can have up to 4 wives. But a lot of people don't understand that that has to be based and it's contingent upon the other wife or the other wives saying it's okay. So it's not like a man can just have his harem and keep marrying people. And also, I think it's interesting that we should look at this within its socio-political, historical context. Because in the Bible, King Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines, okay? So actually 4 is kind of like saying, okay, you can have 4. Yes.
And actually, to add to that, so the rest of the ayah says that you must be fair and equal to all of them.
Yes.
And then it continues on, and you will not be able to.
Exactly.
All of us that have kids, and then to add to one more thing, it actually came to a limit. So in the time of the Prophet, it was actually, now we look at it as they're allowed to have 4, but in their times they were limited to 4.
Yes.
Because before that, you could just marry as many as you could afford to marry.
Yeah. Alicia.
Can I ask a personal question?
Oh my god, no personal questions.
Will you marry someone, would you let somebody have 4 wives?
No. No. Oh, and then a lot of times people try to talk about the Prophet Muhammad because after his first marriage, he did have several wives. But not that those women weren't virtuous women after Khadijah that he married, but those were also for political alliances, and a lot of times also they were already virtuous women, and they were widows and things like that. This was a time when Muslims were being slaughtered by the different Arab tribes, and so it was actually done as a kindness. And when he was married to Khadijah, he was monogamous, and they were married for 25 years. So I think that should tell you something too.
I think that the historical context, which you said, is very important. The historical context is that there was a time of the men were being killed in large numbers, and that left a lot of orphans, that left a lot of women without, the men have gone to battle and they have died. So it's sort of like embracing somebody who was not, didn't have a husband at the time. But I agree that there's some historical context to that, and to bring that context into nowadays context is a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah.
I think that if it's been mentioned in the Bible, we were talking about the Solomon having, Solomon has 700 wives and 300 concubines, which means he had a harem of 300 women. And this is true of Abraham too, and these patriarchs of the Middle East, it was normal. It was normal in those times. Even Christian kings actually had they had several mistresses and things like that, but for a very different purpose. And I think that the historical context that we should understand that it's very important to know that there are some things that apply in that time that don't necessarily apply in today's time.
No. And actually, in Islam, it says that the house that keeps an orphan is blessed. So that goes along with that same paradigm of thought, that you should be making your choices in your home based on what's merciful and what's kind, and not just what's convenient, but what's socially right.
I'm a little confused. Is there a specific reason why you're hearing that?
There's many.
There's many
so
reasons
many.
for that.
I could write a book on it. I'm glad my wife's not here.
What was the question again?
But I don't understand how that can come about of, perceived by others? Like, I don't understand.
Well, in Islam, it's limited to 4, but this is not a common thing. This is not a common thing that's normally done. But I have noticed that it's a misperception about Muslim men, that people say that about Muslim men, so.
I will actually.
Yasmin, she wanted to ask you that why is there a need for married women?
Well, I think that's based upon, that's not religious, that's based upon, we're human beings, right? So I think that, a lot of men go and they have affairs. I think this is a way of legitimizing instead and saying, well, these people are my wives. So that's the way I see it.
Yeah, there's actually, I won't go into details because there's literally books on this, right? So, but I'll add another aspect to it, the cultural aspect. The cultural aspect, Islam is not a race, right? So you can look at Judaism, for example, and for the most part it's a race, right? But Christianity and Islam, I think, share the part that it's not a race. It's something that goes from China to America.
It's not a race either.
Sorry?
Judaism is even not a race. We've got people of different backgrounds, but I get your point.
Okay, so it's fair. It's not associated with a tradition that runs within Islam. So as it transferred across the world, there's certain places where you'll find it very, very rare for Muslims in Pakistan to have multiple wives.
Right.
But I'll disagree with you that it's rare because it's very common in the Middle East. If you go to Yemen, it's extremely common. I lived in San Francisco and I had a lot of Yemeni friends, and a lot of these guys were married to 2, 3 women, and it was perfectly normal to them. And I kid you not, and it was perfectly normal to them, right? And within their Yemeni community and in Yemen, it's perfectly acceptable, and none of the women are mad about it. Like what you just said. Now, I married an Indian girl who would kill me if I married a second girl, right? So I come from a different place where it's not acceptable, right? But is there a place and time for it where it is acceptable? And I'll go back to what she was saying. Yes, it is. Because if you look at the historical aspect of it, regardless of how culturally it was applied, historically, a big part of it was, and this is not within the Middle East, this is across the world. If you look at Native Americans that lived in this land before us, if you look at Europe, or if you look at Latin America, when somebody went out to war and they died, their people, their family, their wife and their children were abandoned. Unless they had a bigger family, so if we're talking about tribal communities, they took care of them, or if they had their immediate family or friends that would take care of them. And in Western culture, it was not unheard of that if somebody goes out to war and they die, that their friend would marry their wife. That was not unheard of either in Western culture. Because it wasn't for the main purpose of, score, I get to bang your wife. It was more of, there's a widow that has kids that somebody's got to take care of. And what happens to them? And then when you build upon a society that is full of women that don't have children. Now this is most closely applied in after post-World War II. If you look at Russia post-World War II or Eastern Europe post-World War II, where there was this massive, 60 million men, 60 million Russians died. Majority of them were men, right? So in Russia or in Eastern Europe, you had this massive void of men. And then it was a legitimate problem. And if you go back to when she was talking about Kosovo earlier, the Balkan Wars, where there was literally a wipeout of men. So you have these women that couldn't be married that had children. So it became a problem. And today, to tie it to today's events, it's Syria. In Syria, there's thousands and thousands of women that are abandoned because they don't have husbands, and they have their children, someone to raise them. So is there a place for it? Sure, you can apply it that way. But if you're going to do it for strictly...
Back to Islam, sorry, but it reminded me before I forget, I think this will kind of answer your question. Within early Islam, the reason there was a rise of polygamy, like with the Prophet Muhammad and his Sahaba, that means the people that were his companions and close to him, was because Muslims were persecuted in the Arabian Peninsula, and they had to move around. There were other tribes called the Quraysh and the Bana. There were a bunch of different tribes, and they were killing them and trying to starve them out, okay? So there were a lot of orphans and there were a lot of widows. And so with the Prophet Muhammad, after his first wife died, they were married for 25 years, they had a couple of kids together, they loved each other. But after she died, he actually did marry a couple of women that were known to be very intelligent and virtuous women, but they also happened to be widows and they needed protection.
Actually, every wife after Khadijah, for the Prophet, if we're talking about the Prophet, which is an isolated case, every wife after the Khadijah was a wife for a reason. They were all political reasons, or it was a lesson, or every one of those wives, there's a story behind it.
Right.
But there's many reasons. So the widow thing is one reason. Another really, really weird one, because my mother is like you and my wife and like you. My dad was to marry a second one. My mother would go, crazy and kill him. But I remember meeting someone. We met someone, and this is in Canada where it's illegal. And it was a guy, a woman, and a younger woman that lived together, and they were married. So this man had 2 wives, and my mom was like, you're okay with this? Like, how are you okay with this? And she said, well, we lived together and I couldn't have children. And I am the one who wanted to have children our whole lives. And I've asked him many times to go out and like marry or do something else and have a child, because I know he wants to have a child. And he wouldn't leave her. So they stayed married together until their 60s. And in their 60s, she convinced them to marry again. And she says that she found this girl for him. And he married this girl, and the 3 of them lived together in a house. And she goes, to me, she's like my daughter, and the kids are like my grandchildren. And she goes, I don't mind it at all. So as bizarre as the situation sounds, and as illegal as it is, it happened to make a whole family happy. So, which is completely different than the whole widow scenario. Now there is the other scenario of, legalizing the aspect of, this is up until early 19th century, where in Europe it was perfectly acceptable if you could afford it to have a mistress. There was nothing wrong with that. Every high, noble, and mighty had a mistress, and it wasn't. And in the situation of a mistress, the mistress did not get any of your money, right? Your mistress does not take over your money if you die, right? She had no inheritance. In Islam, the mistress is a wife, and she does get that. In a mistress status, the children from the mistress are a bastard. And if you look through European history, a bastard cannot rule after a king. Right? It has to be from noble blood. So even if the king lived with the mistress and the bastard child was a true child to him, that bastard child could not go on to rule. Right? In Islam, the bastard child is a legitimate child and can, take over his dad's rule or can take over money. So it approached. I agree with you that in today's society we have things like welfare and alimony and there's things that take over that will help take over. Make sure that the women's needs are covered and the children's needs are covered. We've come up with a different system, but in my opinion, I think in that time there was a different system. And is it abused? Absolutely, it's abused. And is it practiced in the way it was supposed to be practiced? Absolutely not. But just like everything else, there's many things that are taken and they're not used the way they're supposed to use, and people will look for loopholes and whatnot. So I agree with you in the sense that in many ways there aren't a reason, and men just do it just because they can. And it's not the right way it's supposed to be done. And just like she said, it's not the right way that it's done. And are they practicing the rules of how you're supposed to marry and what the circumstances are? No.
If you go in India and Pakistan, you will not find any such
you won't find it.
That
doesn't exist.
So there is only one wife, and that's
it doesn't exist. So it just depends on where culturally where Islam traveled.
And remember, it's like that region is the region of where the population is almost about 1.7 billion. So almost 1/3 people of the world lives over there, but you can't hardly find anything like
Out of
this.
the Muslim population, I don't know if all of you caught that, but 62% of the Muslims in the world are from South Asia and Southeast Asia. So that's India, that's Pakistan, that's Indonesia.
Nothing to do with Arabs.
Yes.
Oh, the Middle East is in general.
War is not from the place of origin of Islam.
No,
It's a minority. It's by far a
They're
minority.
from South
Origin of
Asia
Islam
and
is a
South
minority
West.
compared to those areas that are not the origin of Islam.
Yeah.
I think last year when I did this presentation,
And how many
there was more Muslims in Germany than there are in Syria or something like that.
How many Muslim countries are there? 48 or something like that? In the
don't
world,
know.
there are many, so different cultures.
Different cultures, different interpretations. Yes, you've been raising your hand.
Sorry, I would like just to add something. As my colleague said, my English is so sorry.
No, it's fine.
I hope you're not yelling at me. You're going to beat me
So
up after.
about the polygamy, when Islam came, people in Middle East and these Arab countries, they were treating women very bad. So when Islam came, because it was a lot of prostitution and a lot of wars and a lot of any man who had a baby guy can leave his wife. If she gave to him a baby girl, he killed the daughter
If I had a girl,
before Islam,
right.
and he divorced her.
Yeah.
And he divorced her. So it was a very big issue for humanity and for all females that they have a baby girl, they get divorced. And in scientists, we proved that the man who can give girl or baby, which
Generally, just like
he gives X, Y, and XY. I'm sorry, it's French. XY and the lady always give X. So, which means always it comes from him. If he has a baby girl, it's because of the man. If he get a baby guy, it's because of him. Also, something I would like to add something additional. In the history, most of like President Berlusconi, the ex-president of Italy,
Oh,
they
yeah.
touched him. Sarkozy, ex-president of France, Bill Clinton, also.
I know, but now it's illegitimate. Like now it's looked down upon. But it wasn't until very recent that it wasn't. It was
In
perfectly
France
acceptable.
especially, it was like the norm.
Yeah, it was very acceptable.
Yes. No, I mean about cheating. Like a leader of a country,
Yeah.
he cheat even on his girlfriend or his wife. But if you go even to the Arabic world when the majority are Muslims, if you go like let's say in my country, the king of Morocco, no one gonna judge him if he wants to have another lady, another wife. But there's only one. If you go to the leaders of the Islamic country's wife, because if he decides to have another wife, he can't. His wife should accept that because that's the law. And if she says no, he cannot have another.
Yes, exactly.
And also, my wife, she converted 2 years ago to Islam. I didn't tell her anything. She was actually anti-Muslim before she knows about it.
Yeah.
She thought you were going to have one of the other three.
State applications for that.
I would love to advise people to travel, because when you travel, you discover different cultures, different religions. In my country, you find a church, you cross, you find a mosque. If you cross, you find a synagogue. Everyone is equal, and the majority are Muslims.
You are from, I'm sorry?
Morocco. And the big example in the Second World War that is finished in 1945 and starts in 1939, when Adolf Hitler was killing all Jewish people, is the King Mohammed V, which is the grandfather of the actual king, who welcomed all Jewish people that they were coming from Poland or Ukraine or anywhere. And he protected Christians also, because everyone is equal under the law of God. And no one should judge anyone.
That actually happened in Albania during World War II as well. I'll come to you in a second here. But I think this is really interesting. At the beginning of World War II, at its inception, there were only 200 Jews in Albania. It's a mostly Muslim country with some Christians. By the end, by 1945, there were 2,000 Jews there. There's a really beautiful book. It's called Besa, and it's about Albanian Muslims. And it has pictures too. And they have, some of them have like the Torahs and different things from the Jewish people that they actually took into their home and protected during World War II. And they talk about it, that as Muslims, that it's their duty. It's their duty to protect humanity. It's their duty, because in the Quran it says that if you kill one innocent person, as if you have killed all of humanity. So, of course, that says something about our duty towards making sure innocent people don't get killed as well, naturally, logically. And yes, you have been raising your hand.
Oh yeah, my question is about if girls get like a certain education at school, like about religion,
Sure. I think it depends, like we were saying, from culture to culture. My mom is actually a convert. She was Jewish, and my dad is Muslim from Pakistan. And when I was growing up, I grew up in Chicago, and that was like a normal thing. People of all kinds of different ethnicities mixed and stuff. But anyways, I went to Islamic school, and I started that when I was like 8 or 9 years old, because usually they say when you're 7, you can start reading the Quran and you can start praying. And actually that really lines up with psychology and more modern things, because they say that your mind can actually be more logical and see things more linearly. Once you're 7 or 8, you're like in a different phase psychologically. And then also by the time you're 9 or 10, you hit puberty, and then there's all kinds of things you need to learn Islamically as a boy or as a girl. So for me, my family talked to me about those things, but I also was in a community of other Muslims where I went to Sunday school. Yeah.
Did you have a special dress code or?
I mean,
Sunday's best.
yes. I mean, basically, sometimes I would wear traditional Pakistani clothes. Other times, I would just wear like a modest top and some jeans, and I would cover my head. Now, a lot of times Muslim women will just cover our head when we wear hijab, when we go to the mosque or when we're reading the Quran or something like that. But in regular, everyday, wear, we don't. So I would cover my head, and I would wear sometimes Pakistani clothes, so it's like a long dress with pants. And sometimes I would just wear like my jeans with like a long top. Nothing too fancy.
I want to add something like a colleague that I know that we have come to that sometimes. And the issue, another is kind of like not related, but the issue of alcohol consumption, right? So the Quran says something about, look at this, it's prohibited that you go drunk to make a prayer, right?
Yep.
So it's not necessarily telling you that you cannot drink, but it's telling you not to go wrong.
Well, it started with don't approach, but it went on to don't even approach alcohol and avoid alcohol.
Right, so the way that it is written in the scriptures, sometimes it tells you, no, don't do this, it's okay if you can do this to a certain limitation, but you have to pay attention to this too, and the more important thing is prayer, right? So if you have to choose between drinking and prayer, it's very difficult. You have to choose prayer.
Yeah.
So you don't choose drinking. So that's a way to dissuade the person, right, from doing a certain thing. And the same thing, I think it goes with the 4 wives issue, controversy. That was actually the number 4 was a limit, like you were saying, it's a limit. It's not like it was a privilege that was being given, it was actually a limitation compared to the times. So it was also, if you keep reading those verses, it says that you have to treat equally everybody. But if I would give you an advice, keep one. So basically, that's the argument in the end. And maybe there could be an argument that the Quran itself encourages monogamy because it's telling you, or it's implying that it's very difficult to maintain a relationship with more than one wife.
I'm married, Anna.
So I think in closing, my main point wasn't just about women in Islam, was that essential to Islam is civil rights, is human rights, is respect for humanity. So the first Muslim convert was Khadija. The second Muslim was Bilal. And Bilal actually was a freed slave. I think his ancestors were from like Abyssinia or somewhere, okay? That's today's Ethiopia. He was freed by Abu Bakr because in the Quran and in Islam it says that you need to free slaves, that this is not right. Okay? Then the Prophet Muhammad, one day in the middle of a huge bazaar, like people were shopping and talking and everything, he actually said, you know what, these people think, because like Mohammed said, Arabs were very racist and misogynistic at that time. He said, you know what, these people think they're better than you, but they don't have your character. And he was known to have a really beautiful voice. So he became the first Mosin in Islam, and Mosin means a person who does the call to prayer. You know, you see it in movies, the guy that goes to the top of the minaret and calls everybody to prayer. Well, Bilal was actually the second Muslim convert, and he was the first Mosin of Islam. So Islam's practice in itself, historically, as well as within our Quran and our Hadith, state equality of human beings and to judge people by the contents of their character. And so I think that's the main precept that I'm going back to when I talk about women in Islam, is that in Islam, men and women are equal, all people are equal, and if you're going to be judged by anything by God, it's going to be what's in your heart and how you treat other people. That's it. Oh, yes, ma'am.
It's just something curious.
No.
Is it hard for all of you from over there in a different country, in a different culture? From here in America, we have another.
Well, I mean, you weren't here earlier, but actually I was raised in Chicago, Illinois, and my mom is a nice Jewish girl from Chicago. Her family has been here for a while now, and actually, I know a lot of Muslim Americans, and so for me, my identity is with my mixed background of Jewish and with Pakistani, but also I'm an American. And I really think it's fascinating, Muslims in America. And actually, as far back to like the 15th century, there were the first the first person to like create Coney Island in New York was actually a man who was half black and half white, and his name was Ban Sali. And Ban Sali actually would fight with the colonists about how they treated the Native Americans. And this is kind of funny, but he had a German wife because his mother was like some kind of African, maybe she was a Moroccan, and his father was actually a Dutchman who became a Muslim, and he was known as the Turk. And he was actually an interesting character in European history. But Ban Sali, that created Coney Island in New York City in the 1400s and 1500s, one of the first settlers, his wife was some German lady who would get in trouble in town. And Ban Sali would always get her out of trouble. She was like a drunk and she would run around. But long story short, Van Salih actually was a practicing Muslim, and his Quran was actually sold not too long ago for like thousands of dollars. It was in a museum somewhere. And there are actually a lot of prominent Americans that actually do have some of his blood, because his daughters wound up marrying into the Vanderbilt family, the Madison family, like several different like presidential and really rich families. But a lot of times people like even Jackie Onassis, who was Kennedy's wife, she didn't want to admit it. There was some interview way back when in the 50s and 60s, and she said something like, oh, Van Salih, they were Jews. If you guys look into Van Salih, and actually a couple of years ago, PBS did a really interesting documentary on him. He was a fascinating man. He did stand up for human rights. He did colonize, one of the first colonizers of Coney Island in New York City. So Muslims in America go back a long time. Meaning, at the same time of Van Salih and before, we also have, the Africans that were captured and brought here as slaves, and a lot of them were Muslims as well. So if you want to talk about Muslims in America, at least from my perspective, it's not an outside culture. Muslims have been in America before some of the white people have been here.
Okay, but, okay? I just curious.
Yeah.
Because for me, okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Let me see. Because look, I'm a Hispanic, and I was born here, but I live more time in Mexico. And for me, I'm trying to understand. I wish you could tell me in a little bit of words.
Yeah, no, let me try.
What is Islam woman? I hear beautiful things about you, because for me, because we don't see too much Islam over there in Mexico.
Sure.
But I only can imagine seeing him and the way the garments, the clothes they're wearing, and Allah is a God? Or what?
Well, Allah is just a word for God, because Christian Muslims also call Allah God. It's the same thing.
Okay, I don't know too much. Can you just describe me with little words what these women or you are or he is?
Definitely. I think, it means just submission to God and to live in peace. That's all it means. That's what Islam means. That's what it means to be a Muslim. It's just to be a peaceful person who tries to live by God's word. That's all.
But the things there are in the news are only
But
a lot of bad things.
Definitely, but tell me this: do you think the news covers everybody fairly?
No. The news always gonna get horrible things.
It sensationalizes it.
But
right?
here I'm just watching you, and you're talking about just love and respect.
Absolutely.
Is that the real reason?
Do you know, before every chapter of our Bible, the Quran, before you say anything, you have to say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. That means Allah. That means God, the most compassionate and the most kind. And when we're praying, we say that again and again and again. The thing we repeat the most is God, the most kind and the most compassionate. So I think that tells you something about Islam.
And what is that? Why does she have to put on the
She doesn't have to. It's her choice. In Islam, everything is choice. There's no compulsion.
why is the choice?
Because you can identify her as a Muslim.
It's like a dress code. It's like an
Identification.
identification for Muslim.
Yeah. Okay. But I'm a Muslim too, and I don't do it.
And you do.
And you don't have to. I'll do it if I go into the mosque, because in my mind, I'm saying, okay, this is different than other times. Right now, I'm giving my full attention to God. I'm going to cover my head and do that. But when I'm out here, I don't do it. I focus on what's in my heart, yes, but I don't do it. But in Islam, there's no compulsion. You can do what you want. It's just
Okay,
be modest.
wants to talk.
If I may.
Everybody has an answer. That's good.
That's you.
Just to answer your question, as in how to describe how we are in 3 words. Technically, it would be possible to describe how we are in 3 words. And what I could tell you is the best is keep coming to these lectures and to find out for yourself how we are. Because we can tell you we can spend whole weeks and whole months telling you how we are. But if you can truly find it for yourself, that would be the best answer for you. And
I would say definitely Sunday would be a great day.
Sunday, we're having an open house at our mosque at 5 o'clock, and there'll be lots of free food.
Let's get to the
Let
point.
me have a moment and actually.
Not only the free food, ethnic food.
Ethnic
I
food.
think the question you have would have been very well addressed in the lecture we had yesterday, because yesterday we talked about religious tolerance. And we talked about some of the ideas about why some people use violence, right? Like you said, for instance, I think that's where you are coming from, is that the media has focused on violence and Islam. Now, let's put this into their context too. Every religion, every monotheistic religion, including Christianity, including Islam, even including Judaism, have elements of violence in their scriptures. And you can read that.
Yes, I know.
If you read the Bible in the book of Joshua, right? I don't know if you ever read it. Joshua is actually preparing to take the promised land. So God is talking to him. And then when he goes into Canaan, the promised land, a mass slaughter happens. I mean, a mass slaughter. This is probably one of the worst wars of conquest that you can read about. And that's in the Bible. Okay?
Yes, I know.
That's in the Bible. When you read the book of the Apocalypse, Revelations, right? That's a very violent book. That's a very scary book. Probably one of the scariest books that I ever read. Okay? How is Jesus portrayed here in the book of Revelations? It's not portrayed as the person who come and teach peacefully, you know, the disciples, and then love your neighbor. That's not the Jesus that you see in Revelations. But the Jesus that you see in Revelation is the sword, the knight coming on horseback and killing the nations and bringing justice by the sword, right? So Islam was also founded under the context of the creation of a community of righteous people, okay, that had to leave a certain city to move to another city, and while being in that other city, it was persecuted by the neighbors. Okay, so there was a point where this Muslim community, in order to survive, had to fight back. So, in order to understand those verses, there are verses in the Quran that actually say, look, you have to use certain forms of defense. You have to strike, right? And it has to be understood in the context of what was going on at the time.
Yes.
Now, some people with no scruples at all, people who actually like to manipulate the scripture, then they read the scriptures and say, look, God told me that I can, do violence, right? Because it says here. No, that has an historical context, back to in the 7th century. It's not applicable now. So some people who want to manipulate the Quran, right, and then they say, and justify the violence, they go into these verses and say, God told me that I can kill his people. And that's not what he's saying. Because that would be tantamount for me to say, if I go to the Bible, yes, I can. If I take out of context, I can say, look, God told me to be like Joshua, right? So I'm going to conquer this city and he's going to wipe everything out. That's not what God wants you to do.
Yeah.
That's what the context, the historical context, right? It was written in the historical context of that particular area. So that explains today aberrations that we see today, such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, these terrorist groups, right? Who they're very interestingly enough, they call themselves Islamic. They call themselves Islamic, and their followers think that they're actually doing something Islamic too. And then what happened? If I have some prejudice against Islam, against the religion, it's very convenient for me to say, look, what is Islam? Well, Islam is not what Ms. Yasmin Shariff has been talking about here, or what moment we've been talking about on Sunday, or what I talked about yesterday. That's not what Islam is about. Islam is about these guys saying that they're Muslim because they're saying so, because they're taking things out of context from their sacred book, and they're executing that violence, right? So if I am anti-Muslim, it's very convenient for me to say, what's Islam? Islam is ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and so on. So the media, on the other hand, it exaggerates by providing a picture in which the word Islam and violence is together. And in fact, I'm going to challenge all of you to make a Google search. Type the word Islam in Google, and you see what you're going to get. Just Islam. You're going to get ISIS, you're going to get heads chopped off, you're going to get all of these things. We're obviously not Islam, but that's what is out there understood as Islam. That's the purposes of what we have, what we've been doing here. So I think it has to do with the misconceptions, right, and the confusion that is the term Islam with violence.
So if Islam teaches, so Muslims are almost 1.5 billion
Yes,
in the
we
world.
are. Yes.
So if Islam teaches violence, I think 1.5 billion people will be wiped off in the next 2 or 3 years because they are fighting with each other.
Well,
they're killing. But it's
Also,
not
we
like
have to
this.
look at this, we have to look
It's
at this. ISIS kills mostly other Muslims. okay?
Other Muslims.
That's
are
who
not
they
even-
kill the most of, are
Yes,
Muslims.
they are
That's what
not
ISIS
killing
kills.
Christians. They are actually killing Muslims.
And also they start good and bad of all kinds. We see the KKK, they call themselves
Right.
Christians. We see Nazis, they call themselves
But-
Christians. Are those people very Christ-like? I read the Bible. I know that that's not Christ-like or Christian at all. That's the actual antithesis. Yet those people burn crosses in front of people's homes and call themselves Christians. It's the same thing with ISIS. Those people call themselves Muslims, but they do the very opposite of what our religion teaches.
So one thing is the ideology and the religion, one thing are the practitioners, the way the practitioners distort it or practice it. Like in the Catholic Church 400 years ago, 500 years ago, if you said that the earth was round, right, and not flat, you could be burned in the stake for saying something like that.
Yes.
Right? Or if you say, no, I don't like what the Pope, I don't respect the Pope, but I want to find Martin Luther, I want to follow Martin Luther, right? You could be regarded as a heretic, right? And you could also be accused in the Inquisition and be killed. There was no form of freedom of expression of any kind, right? But we're not going to say to every Catholic nowadays, here, look, you are inquisitorial, or you are a crusader, or you're somebody who condone the practices that your institution, your religion have done in the past, right? Because that's not true. Because if the Catholic Church ever did that, we know now, because we know better, that they were straying away from the teachings of Christianity, from the essence of what Christianity was supposed to be like. So it's a very thin line to separate the practitioners, right? And some people who distort the message
Yes.
and the message itself.
It's the one
And this
line.
brother's been wanting to say something. I'm sorry, I don't know.
Yeah, no problem. I really appreciate, ma'am, that she asked me a question about Islam. I would love just to give a small summary, which is if you would like to, if you are a Muslim, you have to believe the same thing that a Christian or a Jewish believe. We do believe in God, in Adam and Eve, that God created Eve from the rib of Adam, Abraham, Ismail, David, Moses, Isa, and Muhammad, the last prophet. That's the difference. And we only pray 5 prayers per day, and we fast to always remember that there are a lot of poor people that they need food. So to give always donation that there are in Africa, in South America, in Asia, to remind that there are people that they need. That wear askar. Jewish people, if you go to Israel, you see the religious people, they wear also askar on their head. She's Muslim, my wife she's Muslim, and this lady she's Muslim. They're all equal, just she's conservative. She loves to keep maybe herself like and pray, and her beauty maybe she wants just to show it to her maybe to her
I would
husband.
say, are you familiar with the Bible, St. Paulo, St.
Yes,
Paul?
yes,
Right,
yes.
St. Paul advises, St. Paul basically wrote the New Testament, most of the New Testament in the Bible. And then he advises the woman in the congregation to be modest and to be covered in a hijab form of a veil. And that's a Christian. The St. Paul is one of the first Christians, right? And he's advising his congregation to do that. So that's not definitely that's not a proper, or that's not unique to Islam.
And why do you dress like that?
It's
Culture.
It's
basically cultural thing.
Okay.
It's a cult- it's
No,
cultural.
I came here for it to ask.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
It's very convenient as well, honestly. If you wear it, you will be so comfortable, you will feel
Okay,
so
let me answer.
just try it once.
Let me answer.
Particularly in the summers of Laredo, this is the best. You people have no idea.
I know, you look comfortable.
It's very comfortable.
Okay, let me answer. Like he and we both are Pakistanis, like we are wearing this dress. And she's also from Pakistan and she's wearing a jeans and a shirt.
Yeah.
So it's more of a cultural thing than a religious thing. Plus, about, you just asked the question about the head covering. Number one, it's basically a Muslim identity, this is what we call it. And it's not compulsory. Like, we can or we may choose to wear it or we may choose not to wear it. But we are like encouraged to do so. Why? Because we are told that anything which is precious to us we keep it undercover, right? If we have diamonds with us, we keep it
Okay.
undercover.
Okay.
So we believe that anything which we have precious, it should be covered.
Okay.
So that is one of the logics that we kind of follow when we do it, but it has nothing to do with compulsion. It has nothing to do with like that we are forced to do it. No, it's not like that. It's just by
Because they are proud of their culture too, and they like to dress because they're proud of their culture. In Mexico, you go to Mexico, there's a lot of dresses that the women
Yes.
use, right?
Yes.
And you go to Cuba also, there's a very different ways of dressing, and people use traditional dresses to also show that they're proud of their background. I don't know, somebody, are you from Nigeria, man?
Liberia.
From Liberia, but I have a lot of friends from Nigeria. There's also a lot of traditional dresses that I know from friends from Louisiana that I met, and they dress in their traditional Nigerian dresses. But I think there's an element of culture and religion. See, and I think that they also they're showcasing that they're proud of their roots and their origins. I
Okay,
think
and I admire it. Now I admire it more.
I highly,
Because
I highly
That's
agree. I really loved your question. Your question was awesome. It was
Yes,
a very
it's
straightforward,
pure out
basic
of
question.
curiosity.
But I really encourage you to stop by on Sunday. We're having this open house, and it's going to be pretty much like basics of Islam and Islam in America. So it's pretty much geared around your like the whole topic is going to be answering that question alone. And you get to see what a mosque is. There's going to be a bunch of Muslims there. We're bringing different foods and stuff. So I highly encourage you to stop by sometime on Sunday, and anyone else to stop by on Sunday.
This Sunday, Friday.
This Sunday, inshallah.
Also,
Okay.
I would like to add something. I would like to add something about news. News, we should not trust every news. If we would like to have an opinion, to watch different kind of news from different countries, or if we have the ability to travel somewhere. Like let's say the ISIS, these terrorists that they start killing from Muslims in Middle East. They bombed my country, Morocco, twice, and they killed Muslims in Morocco. They did many things. They are not representing Islam or Muslims. We call them Muslims, but they are just gangs. Why? Like every single religion has her follower, the good person, and some people that they use the religion for goals. Let's say in the First World War, when Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Jordan, Palestine, all these countries, even India was colonized 600 years from England. All these around 7 million Muslims, they got killed just from non-Muslims. But no one blamed Jews or Christians, or is Spain that came to colonize South Latino, or Adolf Hitler because he was Christian, he killed this or that. It's just a wrong person in the wrong time that he was a president. He decided a wrong war in a wrong time, and it's become like this. But no one judged anyone. But how, sir, you said 0.5 billion Muslims. If just 10% of them are 150 million, they can make this word like a zoo. I mean, like a wildlife.
Yes, thank you.
So, there's a difference between the actual practice and the practitioners. We know that about Christianity. We know that there are people who call themselves Christians and they're not Christ-like at all. We know there are people who call themselves Jews, and even Buddhists are killing Muslims in Burma right now. So we know people call themselves a certain religion and they're not. And that's the same with ISIS. That's the same with Taliban and people like that. And what I was trying to show here is that within the actual context of Islam, through our holy book, the Quran, and through historical examples, actually human rights and women's rights and gender equality and human equality is central to the religion itself. So I hope you'll come to more of our speeches, if not on Sunday, some other time, or just on your own, look into it. And thank you for coming in, because I enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you for coming, for your question.
Yes, and I want, okay, and the religion doesn't, you can do everything? Okay, like study, like
I'm working on my master's degree.
Okay. And your husband doesn't say no?
She's a doctor.
Okay.
Medical doctor.
Okay.
I'm a PhD doctor.
Okay.
And she is doing her master's.
I'm doing my master's, I'm divorced, and in my own family, it's mostly female physicians, computer programmers, superintendents of schools.
So
And so everybody in my family is educated.
But if you get married, you can be divorced by the...
Yes.
Yes, and actually, Islam gave that in the Quran to women in about 600 AD.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I think it's okay.
Yeah, looking good. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your participation. Thank you.
You already introduced yourself.
Please.